kind Edward. It was a busy time on the island of Sodor. The engines were getting ready for the railway inspector. They all had to make sure that the lines were fixed, clear and running smoothly. And the stations and sidings had to be tidy. On the day of the inspection, the Fat Controller arrived to see the engines. "My railway needs to be running on time," he said, "so I will give you your jobs and you must stick to them." The engines all agreed. They all wanted the railway inspector to be pleased. "Thomas, you will run your branch line," said the Fat Controller. Thomas whistled happily and set off to collect Annie and Clarabel. "Percy, you're in charge of pulling the post train," the Fat Controller went on. "On my way, sir," smiled Percy. Emily was to work on the branch lines with Molly. Toby was to work with Mavis, Bill and Ben at the quarry. Gordon was to pull the express. Henry was to work at the sawmill. "And James, you will deliver trucks of steel to the Sodor suspension bridge," finished the Fat Controller. "You can rely on me, sir," chuffed James and puffed away. Edward felt disappointed. He was sure he wasn't going to get a good job now. "What can I do, sir?" he asked, looking worried. "I have the best job for you, Edward," smiled the Fat Controller. "You are to collect the railway inspector from Brendam Docks." Edward was delighted. "Thank you, sir," he smiled, and Edward puffed away to collect some coaches. Soon Edward was on his way to the docks, but he was worried. The railway inspector wanted to see a busy railway. "I must make sure I can do a good job," he said to himself. When Edward arrived at the docks, he could see the railway inspector waiting. He was wearing a bowler hat and had a clipboard and pen. He looked important and serious. Edward puffed up alongside. He felt nervous. "Hello," said Edward. He was careful not to let off steam. "Hello," said the railway inspector. "I am here to see what I think of this railway." Edward felt his wheels stand still. "Now I want you to take me to the places I want to go, and I want no silliness. Is it understood?" asked the railway inspector sternly. "Yes, sir," said Edward. Edward took a deep breath and turned to the railway inspector. "Inspector," said Edward politely, "where would you like to go first?" The inspector was surprised. No one had ever asked him a question that nicely to him before. "Well," said the inspector, "as you asked me so nicely, I would like to see the man in charge of the railway, please." "No problem, sir," agreed Edward. "Climb aboard and I will take you there." The inspector agreed and climbed on board the train. Edward blew his whistle and set off for Knapford Station. Edward puffed along the line as smoothly and as quickly as he could. "Must do a good job, must do a good job," he said to himself. Edward puffed into Knapford Station where the Fat Controller was waiting. Edward whistled happily to the children on the platform. The inspector climbed down from the train. "Hello!" cheered the children. The inspector waved to them and then turned to see the Fat Controller. Edward then saw Neville. He looked upset. "What's wrong?" asked Edward. "My coaches are still at the yards," grumbled Neville. "I can't take my passengers without coaches, and there's no other engine to shut them." The Fat Controller sighed when he heard this, but Edward wasn't worried at all. "Don't worry, I'll collect your coaches," smiled Edward, "if it's okay with the railway inspector." The railway inspector thought this was a good idea, and so did the Fat Controller. "Thank you, Edward," said the Fat Controller, "but be quick now." Edward raced to the shunting yards as fast as he could. He buffed up to the coaches and the driver coupled him up. Then Edward puffed back to the station. Soon Neville's coaches were put into place and the passengers climbed on board. Neville felt better. "Thank you, Edward," he said. "Now I can be on my way." The guard blew his whistle and Neville puffed away. The Fat Controller and the railway inspector were impressed. "Come along, Edward. It's time to start the inspection," said the railway inspector, looking at his watch. "Yes, sir," puffed Edward. The Fat Controller and the railway inspector climbed on board the train. "Let's go, Edward," said the driver. Edward blew his whistle and puffed away. The first stop was at Knapford Yards. Knapford Yards was full of trucks. As they puffed to the shunting yards, they saw Rosie and Stanley busy shunting trucks. But as Edward stopped at the platform, Stanley puffed to a stop. He was feeling tired. "I need to take on water," he said. Rosie was disappointed.
"But I can't do all the work on my own,"
she sighed,
"and Oliver is running late."
Then Edward had a thought. "Maybe I can help," he said, "until Stanley has enough water in his tanks." The Fat Controller agreed. "Very well, Edward," he said, "but until it's time to go." Soon Edward and Rosie were busy shunting the trucks. It took a while to sort out the trucks, but soon some of them were sorted. As Edward backed up to the coaches, Oliver puffed him some trucks. "Hello," he smiled. "Sorry I'm late." "I must go now, Oliver," said Edward. "Can you help Rosie and Stanley with the shunting, please?" "Of course I will," agreed Oliver. Oliver puffed away to work and Edward set off again. The next stop was the coaling plant. Edward's buffers ached after shunting the trucks, but he was pleased to have helped out. "I hope the railway inspector didn't mind," he said. "Don't worry," soothed the fireman. "You did a good deed helping Rosie out when Stanley was taking on water. I'm proud of you." Edward smiled. This made him stop worrying. Edward puffed into the coaling plant. Stepney and Billy were shunting trucks. Coal dust flew everywhere and the trucks were grumbling. The railway inspector watched as the engines worked, but then the foreman came to see Stepney and Billy. "A train of coal needs to be sorted," he said. "Murdoch will come by to pick up the twain later."
"But what about all the shunting?"
asked Stepney. "We need another engine," groaned Billy. "Don't worry," smiled Edward. "I'll give you some help." And before anyone could answer, Edward puffed to work. Edward shunted the empty trucks under the chute. Coal poured in and dust flew into Edward's face. "Now this is what I call dusty work," smiled Edward. Edward shunted the trucks into a siding. Then Edward shunted Hector to be filled. Coal poured into Hector. Hector felt very happy. "It'll be good to get back onto the main line," he grinned. Soon the train was ready and Edward was ready to leave again. "Thank you, Edward," whistled Stepney. "You really are a helpful engine." "I'm happy to help," smiled Edward. "A helpful engine is a really useful engine." "Time to go, Edward," called the Fat Controller, leaning out to the window. Edward whistled goodbye and puffed away. Edward puffed past Wellsworth Station. Gordon's Hill was next. "I'll have to have a drink at the next station," he thought to himself. But as Edward puffed up Gordon's Hill, he saw Derek the diesel stuck in front of him. Edward had to stop. "I hate it when I stutter to a stop," he said. "Now how can I get to the fuel depot?" Edward whistled loudly. "Don't worry, Derek," he called. "I'll push you to the top. You need a jump start." Edward's driver spoke to Derek's driver and they agreed. Edward buffered up behind Derek and he began to push. Derek was heavy, but Edward was determined to help. His wheels spun, his pistons pumped, and then at last Derek began to move. Edward slowly pushed Derek up the hill, but he didn't know that the railway inspector was writing something on his clipboard. The Fat Controller was worried. Then Derek felt his wheels reach the top of the hill. Edward and Derek started to roll down the hill, faster and faster. Then Derek's driver pushed the start button and Derek's engine roared into life. "Hooray!" he tooted. "Thank you very much, Edward." Edward smiled as he watched Derek chug out of sight. At the quarry, Edward took on water as the railway inspector watched Bill, Ben, Mavis and Toby shunt trucks. Bill and Ben wanted to be naughty, but as they buffered up some trucks, Edward whistled loudly. "No tricks, you two," he said sternly. Bill and Ben sighed. "Yes, Edward," they moaned and they puffed back to work. For the rest of the day, Edward took the facts controller and the railway inspector to all the places they had to go. Edward helped out as much as he could. It was hard work, but he was pleased to be doing some work. Later, as the sun was setting, Edward puffed back to the docks. The inspection was almost over. The facts controller had to speak to the railway inspector at the docks. Then Edward saw Emily up ahead. Emily wasn't happy. Her trucks had come off the tracks, and a load of steel girders had fallen across the lines. "I'll go and get help," puffed Edward, and puffed onto the signal box.
Thank you, Edward,
said Emily. Edward stopped at the signal box and told the signalman what had happened. The signalman telephoned for help, and soon Harvey, Molly and Rocky were on their way. Harvey and Rocky were soon busy clearing the tracks. It took a while, but Emily was on her way again. Meanwhile, Edward puffed into the docks where the ship was waiting. Edward stopped by the ship, and the facts controller and the railway inspector climbed out of the train. The railway inspector looked at his clipboard. "After today's visit," he said, "I have to say that this railway is very busy. The engines have been working hard, and all the work has been getting done." Edward listened carefully. "So I give this railway full marks," finished the railway inspector. The facts controller was very pleased. "And also," the railway inspector went on, "I have to say that Edward here is one of the best engines I have ever met." Edward was surprised. "He was very polite to me this morning. He gave us a pleasant ride, and most of all," he added, "when an engine needed help, he was quick to act. He helped out lots of engines today, and that's what I do like to see." "I agree," smiled the facts controller. "Edward, you have worked very hard today. As a reward, you shall have a new coat of paint." "Oh, thank you, sir," gasped Edward with delight. "You are indeed a really useful engine," smiled the facts controller. "Thank you for a wonderful day, kind Edward," smiled the railway inspector. Edward was so happy he couldn't think of anything to say, so he blew a kind and cheery whistle, and the facts controller and the railway inspector had to agree that no engine had been more helpful today than Edward.